Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun. Today we have episode 4 of the popular and excellent Philosophy with Jigmo series. Today's topic will be the philosophy of animal rights. And we will get into that right away, but please follow and subscribe to our YouTube and BitChute channels where you can find over 200 Roundtable Podcast episodes. And most of all, join the Roundtable Discord server where you can find links to all of our different platforms and our podcast recorded daily at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. So thank you for joining me again, Mr. Jigmo. How are you today, sir?
I'm excellent. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. It's my work evening, 8 p.m. Looking forward to another interesting discussion and very happy to be doing it. So did you have a bit of maybe a presentation style or that you wanted to introduce in that way, or would you like me to do question and answer like an interview? Because I'm good with either way.
No, Shogun, I action written out, but I know that if we get into the discussion, I will eventually get to say a lot of the stuff that Peter Singer wrote, a lot of his ideas, in our discussion, because we've had such discussions before, and I just know that the stuff is going to come up. So if you're comfortable and if you feel prepared, I would love to take questions and kind of do it back and forth, and then eventually open it up to the audience.
Sure, I'm 100% good with whatever format, but if we take what Zoo calls a dialectical format, sort of half a hybrid of an interview and open discussion sort of thing. So I guess touching on animal rights as a subject, is the question of to what extent do animals deserve moral considerations, or to put it another way, to what extent are we morally obligated towards animals in the same way that we are with people? And you've introduced this character, Peter Singer. So
Yep.
Maybe, I think you said Peter Singer. So maybe can you just give us an introduction to his contribution to this?
Sure. Peter Singer happens to be one of the biggest, and I guess one of the first proponents of the animal rights movement on the philosophy side. And it is important to note that what Peter Singer is concerned with is not the legal, it is not the social, it is the moral. He wants to claim that there is a grave moral injustice that is occurring here that must be dealt with. And Peter Singer approaches the animal debate from a fascinating point of view, which is the following claim. Claim 1, we humans share certain basic moral rights. Claim 2, we humans come in all different shapes and sizes, colors, intellects, self-awarenesses, even if you have a certain view of self-awareness. Yet among all this difference is an equality in basic moral rights. He calls this the right to equal consideration. All of us have a right to have our suffering considered and not ignored. And what he wants to say is that it is difficult to point out some quality which all human beings share, but all the animals that we're currently torturing lack. And so his point is that if you truly are an egalitarian about human beings, if you believe that human beings share certain basic moral rights, and if you are unable to identify a distinguishing feature between animals and humans, which would ground a disparity in moral value or moral defense, then you should grant the same moral rights, basic moral rights, to animals as you would to humans. Now, there are certain limitations. Naturally, the sorts of rights you can give to beings is immediately tied to what sort of beings they are. For example, it makes sense to, and this is just a coarse example, this may not be a right you agree with, it's logical to give rights to a woman to abort a child on the grounds of bodily autonomy. It's incoherent to give such a right to males because males are just incapable of having babies. In the same way, animals are incapable of doing certain things. They may be incapable of voting and writing books and expressing themselves in a public forum, but they have certain basic moral features that we also have. They suffer, and a lot of them are self-aware in a basic sense, and some more complicated ones can even recognize symbols and be aware of themselves through time, which is absolutely enormous. And what Peter Singer wants to claim is that insofar as those basic features ground our moral value, they also ground the moral value of our friends, the other animals. And it is a grave injustice to treat them in the way that we're treating them now. That's kind of Peter Singer. I hope that's coherent.
It definitely is coherent. And, we can kind of identify a few basic positions that people might take on this issue. And one that would be sort of an extreme position would be that animals have absolutely no rights whatsoever, right? You'll hear Leo kind of advocating this position that we shouldn't consider their rights whatsoever, right? And some people will put a religious point of view on this. God gave us dominion over all things, and so we are legitimately the theologically ordained masters of everything, and we can do anything we want with it without concern. And an extreme position would be, we could even torture animals for fun or kill them for fun because they have absolutely no moral worth, like objects, right? And most of us would be repulsed by that position because we have cats or dogs that we see as like members of the family, and we think horses are majestic, and that the rainforest needs to be protected. So most people are sort of in the middle, where they have pro-environmental and pro-animal rights views, but eat factory farm meat regularly and don't feel any sort of moral contradiction. They just don't consider it, right? Which is interesting. And then the extreme outlier on the other end would be someone who might say animals have the same rights as human beings, and therefore any form of killing them for food or for their fur, or even keeping them as pets perhaps, is a huge moral crime, and you should have to be a vegan and set your cats and dogs free. And so these are kind of three positions that we could identify, right? And I think most of us fall in the middle of saying you can't hurt and torture animals, pets and so forth are worthy of consideration, but you can eat meat, and it is okay to wear fur, right? And I guess that's where the interesting kind of philosophical question is, that middle position, which is, how do people rationalize caring about animals sometimes and completely not caring about them so much the other times? And where do we actually draw those lines, if they can actually be done at all? Sorry, a long-winded way to phrase that.
No. You're absolutely correct. It is when we identify what it is that makes the lives of animals meaningful, what makes their experiences meaningful, is when we can identify when it is permissible to kill them and to engage with them in a certain manner, and when it is impermissible to do so. And I think it is important to analyze why those extremes are wrong. It's difficult to address the religious claims, because the religious claim of human beings have souls and animals do not have souls. It's difficult to evaluate the soul claims without actually evaluating the scriptural claims. So I personally view that not as a discussion in philosophy, but rather as a discology in theology. And I don't want to get into that now. But you do often hear certain people in a non-religious way imply that human beings have some sort of special dignity in virtue of them being human that animals do not have. And one thinking experiment I absolutely adore in these cases, the thing that does all the work in the world, is an alien species. We come across an alien species, who have different bodies. Maybe they're skinnier, maybe they're taller, maybe have more limbs or less limbs, but they exhibit all the desires and fears and hopes and emotions and thoughts that we do. There's a shared experience. There's an empathy. They have every sign of being conscious, of being sentient, of being really, truly alive in a way that matters. It's hard to understand why appealing to a human dignity would matter there. What does it matter that we're human and they're not? Surely we do not get to treat these beings in virtue of them being a part of a different lesser than us. And surely they cannot treat us as lesser than them because, they consider themselves to be alien and advanced and whatever. And there's another version of this that this sort of thinking experiment deals with. The sort of, we are the top predator. I mean, I've heard this so many times on this server and outside the server, that human beings are on top of the food chain. And once again, let's use this example. If an alien race comes and they have better technology and better tools, and they're just better than us, and they say, hey, humans, how great it would be to harvest your organs and harvest your warmth for our personal pleasures, our personal luxuries, we would be disgusted. We would say, I mean, you can do this, you have the power to do this, but surely you're recognized that it is morally corrupt, that it is morally horrendous, and that we share an experience that grounds a similarity in value, that we have shared basic moral rights, that you should consider our suffering as important. On the other end, naturally, you have people who say that animals and humans are in all moral respects equal, or that, I have heard some people say that between a cow and a human, they would be at a loss as to which to sacrifice. I think that is a view hard to justify, because even though humans and animals have certain moral features and certain shared moral rights, it is very obvious that the more desires and the more cognitive activity and the more hopes and the more complexity a being possesses, the more it has a claim to those rights, the more power or pull those rights have, or if we don't like rights talk, the more moral value it exhibits. Um, you know, I think even the most ardent animal activists would agree that an ape which is able to analyze shapes and symbols and remembers which part of the year to wear their red hat during, Christmas is coming, where's my red hat? Um, that being is a little bit more valuable than a chicken or even a pig. But some of these claims are controversial. I don't want to compare things so liberally. What I do want to say is that when we compare the extremes and when we identify what it is that makes the extremes wrong, we can get to the core of what really matters. I think what is undeniable is that suffering matters. We have an obligation to prevent needless suffering. This is it doesn't matter if you're a consequentialist or if you're a deontologist, whatever your views of the origin of morality are. If you engage in the moral language, A, you generally think that suffering is a negative, and B, needless suffering is something that you ought to prevent if you can do so. I think those two are largely controversial claims. I would go so far as to say that people who claim that unnecessary suffering ought not be prevented are not even speaking a moral language. They're speaking some other language. And so, in my view, in light of that, I think the sentience of animals is that basic moral feature which grounds their similarity to us. There is a reason why when I kick a rock, I don't feel anything. I don't feel as if I've done something morally horrendous. But when I kick a puppy or I kick a dog, I feel terrible because I know I made it suffer. And it suffered for a reason it didn't have to suffer for. And I think our current practices in food harvesting, factory farming, these practices are very akin to the kicking of puppies. Necessity. And I don't want to be naive. I don't want to say that, protein and meat aren't important. I don't want to say that, human beings should never eat meat, but I think it matters how we do it. And so when you brought up that question of what is the middle, what is the reasonable median that we should take between these two extremes, my own view is that it is permissible to painlessly kill animals at the end of their lives, and to eat their bodies for sustenance. I think that is something that I am okay with because I do not see any moral abomination being done at that point. But any sort of crowding animals in small spaces and not letting them live, in a sense, their natural lives, taking away their children, milking them for hours on end for resources, all that stuff is so below anything that could be considered humane. It's kind of incredible how we still do it. It seems archaic, but I guess anything for survival, right? So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on that. What do you think, Shogun?
Yes, those are all good points. I'm in agreement, I think, with everything you said, and we'll definitely open it up for the audience participation soon. But I just thought there's a few ways to kind of approach this, right? One, we can look at general principles like you did, right? Which is you should never cause more than the minimum amount of suffering necessary to obtain your food, right? So we could say, okay, yeah, you're permitted to kill to take sustenance because it's naturalistic fallacy, but we see it all through nature, these predator-prey relationships, and we know that we've evolved as predators and that we predate, and that's one of the ways we feed our families. So we can kind of intuit, okay, it's not evil for us to go hunt a fish or hunt an animal. That's not an evil thing I'm doing. But then you say you have to kill the animal in the minimum necessary amount of pain, right? So anything that increases that pain makes it unethical. And then we can also look at that so that we can agree with these principles, but we could also look at specific cases to it's kind of interesting to tease it out, right? So I think about my own moral intuition, right? Like killing a cow for food might be difficult for me to actually do because I'm quite an empathetic person, actually, and I'd probably be pretty traumatized, but my moral sense is there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's actually kind of a noble thing to kill the animal yourself and get the meat. But then if I were to say kill a dog or a cat for meat, then my moral intuition is now troubled. I don't want to kill a dog or cat. This, in my mind, is worse than the cow. So then that raises the question of, is there really a moral hierarchy of animals, or is that just an illusion? And if it's an illusion, what does that tell us about the moral significance of animals at all? Or if it's not an illusion and there is a moral hierarchy, then that tells us something as well, right? And how do we know if we've sorted these things right or wrong, right? And then I'll just say there's certain kinds of food production, like veal, right, where they don't allow the animal to walk. So it's basically kind of tortured its whole life, or foie gras, where they overfeed the animal until its liver becomes fatty, right? It's like torture food, so to speak. So yeah, I guess I'm just, wondering, where do we draw these lines, and what are the ways that we're thinking, right? Is there really a difference between a dog and a pig? And how could we draw the line of what is too much suffering and what is okay?
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point, and I think this is where we need to be very careful to distinguish between disgust responses or familiarity-based responses and moral intuitions. And I think one way we know that we're dealing with moral intuition is that moral intuitions are generally highly systematic. So I have some principle that says, listen, I can kill an animal which is nearing its death in a painless manner for sustenance. And that applies to nearly every animal that I can think of, but it fails to apply to animals I grew up with. Like, it fails to apply to dogs and cats, animals that are commonly in the household. You kind of have to ask yourself, am I having this moral intuition? So is this a moral intuition, or is this a familiarity or disgust-based response? I think generally, if a general principle works across many, many, many cases, I think the painlessly kill an aging animal thing works across every single case for me. But it also fails for, like, dogs, because I grew up around dogs. I think there's an interesting methodology question here where you kind of have to ask yourself, should I give up the general principle, or should I give up the individual judgment? And I think this is where I'm comfortable giving up the individual judgment. And I am comfortable to say, I'm comfortable to go so far as to say that it ended on an island with a human being and there is no other meat source. Um, and your survival depends on aging person who has consented and eating their body. That act of eating is not something that I see a moral badness in. Now, naturally, it is disgusting, and we feel repulsed by it because it's cannibalism. But I think when we separate out what is disgust and what is true moral intuition, I think there really isn't that much morally impermissible there. I don't think there's anything morally impermissible there. It is also worth noting. Sorry, Shogun, I saw you unmute yourself. But
no, that's good. You continue till you're finished. Don't worry.
Yeah. I just want to say that it is important to remember that we've been mistaken in the past, and this is a general point about moral knowledge. One of the gravest mistakes we can make is thinking that we are currently in possession of all the moral truths as a society, or even as an individual, no matter how critically thinking you are, and that really there isn't any more moral progress or moral education to be done. I think that is a horrible place to be in. I think one must always be very morally humble. And I think one of the reasons why the stuff we're talking about has an adverse reaction from people is because they're not very open to the idea of animals having such things as moral rights. And I don't blame them. I think it's a novel thing. I think it's a new thing. But I think as we progress in decades, and you already see signs of this, people will care more and more about where their food comes from. I think there's a particularly interesting point to be made about certain types of animals. I genuinely think that there are certain animals that have desires very similar to ours. So let me elaborate on that. I don't think it's permissible to painlessly kill you in your sleep, because you have certain desires to continue living, to continue existing. You might want a job promotion. You might want to get married. You might want to see your kids go to college. You have certain desires which ground your engagement with time, which ground your right to persist through time and disallow me to painlessly kill you at the age of 20 or 30. And I think the impermissibility of killing you lessens as you get older and older and approach your biological limit. I genuinely suspect that there are certain animals which are cognitively complicated enough, and I'm looking at the apes and maybe even some farm animals, Um, there may be certain animals who just have a self-awareness and an awareness through time, which would make it impermissible to not only painlessly kill them at the end of their death, but also make it impermissible to painlessly kill them in the middle of their life. Sorry. It would make it impermissible to not only painlessly kill them at the end of their life, but also painlessly kill them in the middle of their life. And I think that is a conclusion that people may be a bit more uncomfortable with than the previous one. I genuinely, I think, and a lot of this is speculation, right? Because we have to look at brain sizes and reactions, and there's a lot of empirical stuff here. It's hard to determine which animals feel what and think what, and which animals have certain capacities and which animals don't have certain capacities. I think evolutionary studies and kind of speculation into what animals evolved to do can help us here. And there's naturally always going to be ambiguity and grayness and vagueness as to how much certain animals can do and can't do. But insofar as we're being reasonable and charitable, I genuinely think that certain animals have a right to not only painlessness, but also persistence through time, which is, I don't know, it seems reasonable to me. Maybe you disagree.
I don't disagree. There's a lot of things that come up from this, but again, I do want to make sure we're giving everyone a chance to ask their questions too. Not that we're short of time, so I'll promise this will be my last turn, and then after this, it's going to be open mic. But just wanted to say I agree that we shouldn't cause animals suffering, and that's part of it. But I also agree with you that's not the only consideration. And I think, killing a living thing automatically has a certain sort of negative imputation that we at least want to minimize, even arguably if it's a plant. You know what I mean? And taking away something's consciousness, I agree. There's that, what you're calling like a right to persist through time. But it can even go more than that, right? Like there's countries that have declared certain animals of a higher order to have personhood. And I would agree with this, right? So dolphins have personhood under Indian law, and I think orangutans under maybe Cambodian law or something. And I agree, right? These animals can literally express self-awareness through language and through hand signs. So I think any reasonable person would say, well, this is an animal that we can't morally just kill for its fur, or like you can't just like, oh, we'll make an orangutan purse out of this. That would be horrific, right? Because this thing is like, oh, my name's Coco, I love you. You're not just gonna, chop it to pieces, right? And then, you made another point that was interesting, and I'm not saying you were believing that, obviously you don't, but you made a point earlier about killing animals at the end of their life. And I get the sentiment, but that's actually not a consideration, really. So if you're hunting, right, you'll take an animal that's completely in the prime of its life. You don't wait for like an old animal that's close to dying. You want like a young, healthy animal. But you wouldn't want to take the child, the pups, or the babies, right? And so I think the ethic is really more that you take an animal after it's had a chance to pass on its genetics, right? So as long as this animal's had at least one time to pass on its genetics, you can kill it, right? And then the other is you either allow it to live a natural life in the wild, or you provide it a good quality of life as a farmer. And then if you give it like a good dry barn to go in out of the rain, and a good pasture to eat grass and good feed and medicine take care of it, then you let it pass on its genetics, and then you can actually kill it humanely. So I guess there's sort of a contract or a compact between humans and animals where it should be mutually beneficial, if not for the individual, then for the species, right? But I don't want to go too long on the mic. These are just some of the things that, and I also wanted to say something about cannibalism, but it's a little bit of a derail. So I'm going to pass it back to you, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I've never thought about opportunity to reproduce as a moral property, or as a morally relevant property. I'll have to give that some thought. I never thought about that. I think one fascinating transition that we ought to think about making is that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now, it grounds more, well, other than the example you brought up now, it grounds moral value in mental states, so to speak. It grounds moral value in consciousness. It grounds moral value in awareness through time, or self-awareness through time. Um, there's an interesting topic of ecology. Like when you look at very complicated systems, which may be completely devoid of um, even if they're completely devoid of conscious life, which they aren't generally. But if I looked at this enormous forest of century-old oaks, as an example, complicated roots, enormous, magnificent, beautiful, and they're alive, in a sense that there's this dynamism on the micro level of their existence, even though they're not conscious, even though they're not self-aware, so to speak. We don't have good evidence that they are. There's something of a tragedy and I think you mentioned this earlier today. There's something of a tragedy to those sorts of things, burning or dying, and I think there's a possible transition to be made towards properties which are not mental state based. That we ought to ground moral properties not only in consciousness or self-awareness, but also in complexity. If you have a complex enough living system, that also has a certain moral value and a moral right to not be destroyed. But that's a more controversial claim. It's a more rare sort of claim, but I think it's interesting to think about. We're ready for audience engagement if anybody has any questions or comments.
Does anyone have a question or comment for Jigmo? If not, I have plenty more in mind, but I'm going to give you guys a chance as well. All right.
I have a question.
Please go ahead, Blue.
So currently, would you say most people judge how to humanely kill an animal if they deem their expressions to be, I don't know, sufficient enough to expressive enough to tell that they can feel something? Like, is it judged on the expression? Or is there more, like you said, complex reasons why someone would maybe pause and consider the moral points of how to treat such an animal, or a tree, or any living thing?
Right.
If that makes sense. I'm sorry.
So I'm going to repeat your question to you, and you telling me if I've understood it properly. Are you asking whether the way in which we identify whether certain mental states are present in animals is through their behavior?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating question. I think that there's two things to be said here. One, on a basic level, behavior happens to be good enough. And if you don't think so, you should reevaluate more than your claims about animals. Because I think it is arguable that the way that you know that the people around you are conscious is largely through behavior. It's when people emote, it's when people say things, it's when people seemingly empathize with you and seemingly share some experience with you. You can see it in their eyes, you can see it in the way their body moves. There are certain signs of a life, a conscious experience, an ongoing mechanism in their mind. And the question is, do animals display behaviors animals are, your dog isn't going to talk to you. Your dog isn't going to say, hey, how's your day going? But your dog is going to sulk. Your dog is going to get excited. Your dog is going to act happy when you do something it likes you to do. Maybe if you're punishing your dog for doing the wrong thing, it's going to, act embarrassed. And I've seen this, the body movements and are so recognizable, and they are so close to home that it's difficult to argue that we can recognize consciousness in these animals, but we can recognize consciousness in each other. So that's one part of the equation. Second part of the equation, if you want to get more scientific, listen, we can observe the human brain when it's in pain. We can observe the human brain when it's happy. It releases certain chemicals. There are certain structures and certain connections which are present. And, more and more we find that the same connections and the same chemicals are present in animals. C fiber, related to pain is not unique to human beings. So I guess my answer is, one, behavior should be good enough. If it isn't, that raises some difficulty unless you're a neurologist. But even if you are a neurologist, even if you've made a study of the brain, you'll find that animal brains have a lot of similarities. Because of which we would expect similarity in consciousness and awareness. Not the full spectrum, but enough for them to matter. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I'm also kind of asking if we should rely more on those scientific ways to determine consciousness, or if a certain animal feels pain, then just by their behavior and them expressing it. Because I know a lot of animals probably do feel, have a wide range of emotions, but we just can't see it as we would see a human smiling. Or it's just, we wouldn't relate to it. We wouldn't relate to how they express it, even though they might already be, and it just doesn't show in their behavior.
I hear you.
Yeah.
No, that's well put. I think I'll say this. Between human beings, observing behavior is good enough. But if you want to really, really make sure, if you want to really get into the nitty gritty of what happens and compare yours to theirs, go and do that. And what I want to say for animals is, there are certain animals for which it is immediately present and immediately obvious that they're conscious and that they're experiencing. There are certain animals, in regards to which we are on the fence. And I think for those animals, the brain or observance of the brain, or whatever their organ that does that thing is called, is very important. So maybe a way to put this is, uncontroversially, your brain is causally connected to your behavior. Take away the brain, you take away behavior. You take away a toe, you don't take away behavior. You take away a means of expressing the behavior. So insofar as the brain is the locus of where this stuff emerges from, the stuff that we're looking for as a evidence of consciousness or self-awareness, the closer to the brain you get, the closer you get to the very source of this evidence. So the way I see it is that behavior is good enough. The brain is even better. Sometimes behavior is not going to be enough. That's when we look at the brain and we look for these similarities. Is that, and feel free to tell me if I still haven't answered your question. Is that coherent?
No, you did. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think at this point it would be okay for me to bring up my tangential question. You had mentioned the scenario of someone, consenting for their flesh to be eaten cannibalistically, and how, as long as this was a consensual thing, in principle, there would be nothing wrong with it. And you may be right, but I would like to at least propose a counter argument that there is something immoral about such things as consensual cannibalism, for example. But it would be a different order of morality, right? So you might say to you, it's not relevant. But in other words, I would argue that when you have something that is a universal and ancient taboo, right, something culturally repugnant and repulsive to the vast majority of people, and has been for a long time, that social norm or taboo exists, that it is therefore fundamentally sort of unethical to transgress it, precisely because you're shocking the sensibilities of everybody, right? And the idea of taboos like cannibalism exists because it's like a form of blasphemy, right? So blasphemy means to profane the sacred, right? And we traditionally revered our ancestors. We revered the bodies of the dead, right? So you had to treat the bodies of dead with respect. And so that's why eating the bodies of the dead would be considered desecration of that body and dishonoring of the dead. And in other words, I kind of favor like this order of morality. I think actually does have a place where even the state says, these are things we consider obscene, blasphemous, dishonoring the dead, eating human flesh, vile public performances, right? And some people might say, oh, well, this is, all consenting adults. But I would argue there's some things that even a consenting adult doesn't make morally permissible, right? They're just what you might call depravity.
Yeah, there's this thing called moral dignity, and some people think that dignity persists after life, and so you engaging with the corpse somehow ruptures that dignity. I haven't given this much thought, but I will say this: there's two ways to put this view. One is we are grounding moral properties or moral facts in certain century-old traditions. And I think I fret to take that step because traditions or social norms, no matter how persisting they are, no matter how consistent they are, could have been different. Whereas on my view of morality, I have a very rigid, realistic, not realistic in like, oh, it's so real, but realist view, objectivist view of morality, where morality is immutable and changing, eternal, in the way that mathematical facts are. So I'm a little bit more afraid of putting things that way, but I will say this: it is possible that there are certain moral properties, real moral properties, which do not concern, as I said before, only mental states, but concern structures and complexities and even post-death dignity. So we do have an understanding of dignity. We have an understanding of what it means to embarrass each other and shame each other. And there are certain senses in which it may be morally impermissible to shame and embarrass a human being, even if they do not feel it or experience it, and even if it never brings them any harm. And if you have this working understanding of moral dignity, or dignity as a moral term, then cannibalism may be said to infringe on that. I think fascinating argument to be made. I don't like to multiply moral entities, so I try to reduce dignity to other things. Maybe I shouldn't. I haven't thought about this nearly as much as I should think about it. But if this is so, then I think cannibalism is an excellent candidate for, first on the line, the sort of thing that severs, destroys, reduces human dignity. If this concept doesn't make sense, if it isn't workable within our moral ontology, I think it's plausible to argue that cannibalism is permissible on other grounds. So, fundamental moral debate to be had here that I would have to think about and read about and get back to you.
Yeah, it just reminds me, we actually did a debate on cannibalism back in 2019. It wasn't recorded, but that was really interesting, actually. And your response was interesting as well. This ties into an even more disturbing and strange moral question, right? But I mean, it might sound absurd, but philosophically, I think it's a valid question, right? From a moral perspective to question it, right? So, if a human is already dead, what's wrong with eating them, you might say, right? Because they're already dead anyway. Like, it's not going to make any difference or whatever. Another argument would be if you're okay with taking an animal and cutting it up and causing it to bleed and die, literally ripping it limb from limb, where then does the moral repugnance around something like bestiality come in, right? Which obviously is repugnant. I'm not saying it isn't, but why are we okay with tearing an animal limb from limb but not using it for sport, like cockfighting, for example, or not using it in a sexual performance like pornography, or not using it in art? That's another interesting example I was going to post, but I thought it was too controversial. But this artist tattooed pigs like all over them with like Disney characters and logos from like designer brands. And a lot of people were outraged, but it's like, well, how can you be outraged that these pigs are living art pieces worth a lot of money when you're eating bacon every morning that is now dead pig, right? So, again, I guess what I'm getting at here is there a second order moral wrong here, right? Because we're already at the point we're okay with what you would think is the most severe transgression against something, right? Taking its life through force. And yet we sense that even though we've accepted that, there's still a host of other things that, even if they're less severe, or somehow more wrong because their motivation is something other than simple food, right? Or is this itself misguided?
Yeah. It's funny I mentioned dignity. I guess what I want to say here is that with something, there's a general principle that we ought to apply here that I think is very plausible. The principle is, if something cannot consent to suffering for a greater cause. For example, you can consent to suffering for a greater cause if you can voluntarily, rationally join the military and be subjected to weeks and weeks of arduous training to serve a duty. Okay, you have rationally considered this, you have made the choice, and you have gone to suffer for some greater cause. My own contention is that if a being is incapable of consenting to suffer for some cause or for some purpose, thrusting that suffering upon them because you deem the suffering proper is morally abominable. So the tattoo artist thinking, yeah, I mean, the pig cannot consent to being tattooed, and tattooing is rather painful, from what I've heard. So I think tattooing pigs when pigs do not even have a conception of tattoos or maybe even basic symbols is absolutely. And this is also how I make sense of the abominableness of pedophilia. I think a lot of what grounds the wrongness of sexual acts toward children is their incapacity to understand what even is going on, their incapacity to consent. A more fascinating and dangerous debate is when you have evidence that the animal enjoys it, which is difficult. And this is where I think dignity, what we were talking about before, may serve a very important purpose. Because once again, if the rights we apply to animals are only um, uh, a right to not suffer, if they have certain desires, a right to persist through time, then sex in which both parties derive pleasure seems to not go against any of our currently residing moral principles. And this is where I think something like a human dignity um, quota or a human dignity principle may be very useful. Because I think there's something about that act that is degrading and undignifying or embarrassing to an extent so great that I would be willing to call it moral. To an extent so great that I would be willing to call it a moral transgression. That's difficult. I think bestiality, where we have evidence that the animal is deriving pleasure, is one of the most difficult problems in applied ethics. It's very difficult to make sense of our discussed mechanism there. So, yeah, hard questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question, I guess, that comes to my mind is, even if I accept that I am morally permitted to consume meat, and then maybe I give myself like a criteria where it says I'm only going to eat ethical meat from a humane farmer who I know is doing a good job of farming, right? And that would be already above most people, right? But I say, okay, I can eat meat, but wouldn't I still have to say that, if I took an additional moral effort, or an additional effort, I could actually go vegetarian, right, and not eat any meat and just eat eggs and milk, or then I could go even further and be vegan. And I would intuit that, to the extent that I've already accepted that animals have some moral value and harming them has some moral significance, then even if I'm okay to eat meat, I'd be a better person morally if I didn't, right? And if I was willing to give up all these things, then I would be the best possible moral person I could be. And that would mean then that there is still some negative consequence associated with how I'm eating, which I recognize I could remove. And then you'd be forced with the hard question of, well, if you're murdering one person a month, but you realize you could really be murdering no people a month if you just tried harder, doesn't murdering that one person a month become completely and totally unethical, actually? And I'm asking myself that as someone who eats tons of meat and loves meat, right? But it's like, am I really just bullshitting myself, saying, yeah, I believe animals have some rights and that we shouldn't cause them unnecessary harm, but, I'm going to persist in eating meat regularly, but I think it's okay. Is that really a consistent position,
Yeah, I think it genuinely matters about the origin of the meat, if I am understanding you correctly, and correct me if I am not. Um, there's a sense in which when you go even to, as Leo says, a place where they practice, great husbandry, or they advertise great husbandry, it's difficult to discern whether that's actually what's going on. There's a sense in which you're trusting the person on the other end to not be mistreating the animals. And it's difficult to regulate such things fully from day to day, from week to week, from month to month. And if you believe that animal suffering is truly morally bad, if you believe that they have a certain right to equality of life and to equality of death, if you believe that some among them even have a right to persist through time until old age, a sense in which you shouldn't just trust other beings who say, yeah, we're raising and then slaughtering them properly, because there's all the interest in the world for them to not do so. I think if I was a morally ideal agent through and through, I would not leave these things to strangers. If I wanted to eat meat, I would raise it and treat it myself, and I don't have the time for that or the resources for that. And if I am unable to do that, I would refrain from eating meat whatsoever. And there's a duality there. Number one, you are, if you stop eating meat, you are not personally engaging in this morally abominable act, or seemingly morally abominable act. And on the second half, you're not creating more incentive for the people to continue to do this. Because when you buy the meat, you're not only affirming that the slaughterers have done something good, you're also saying continue doing this because there's a demand. So there's almost a double evil there. Maybe I misunderstood what you said. Is that connected or is that meaningful to you?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Yeah. All I really am saying is, although I think I will continue to eat meat and people are justified in eating meat, I do recognize the moral credit of people who give up animal products, sort of a moral obligation, because I did do it for a few years and it was very difficult. So, I do admire people who are willing to deprive themselves of something out of a moral conviction. And I 100% agree with you that, having ownership over your own animals in your own land and, raising your own chickens and stuff is largely the best thing that we can do, or do your own hunting or have your own relationship with a farmer. But I think there's a few more sort of philosophical aspects of this we can make a little more explicit still. So I'm just thinking, if I go through my set of moral biases, right? Like, one of them is that I have an idea that eating something that is more intelligent is less ethical than eating something that is less intelligent. So I think it's kind of unethical to eat octopus because octopus is highly intelligent, right? So that's, and in a similar way, I wouldn't really want to eat a dolphin or a whale because those things are very intelligent. A second thing that comes to mind is I don't want to eat anything that's a primate, right? So the idea of eating a monkey, a chimpanzee, or an orangutan is very repulsive to me, right? And it feels partly like cannibalism, plus it's also the more intelligent thing. And then I feel that any animal that's domestic, like a cat or a dog, is unethical to eat because they're pets. But then again, farm animals are domestic too, so it doesn't really make sense, but it's still a bias that we have. Certain animals are like friend animals. And then I have the idea that it's how much pain the animal goes through. It could be how much of the animal's life you take away, right? Like you said, if you take its life towards the end of its life, not as big of a sacrifice as if you take it in the prime of its life. So I guess I'm just wondering, do you think there is a meaningful set of criteria like that we can use to kind of filter all of the living things in terms of their ethical value or rights they should have?
I think that there are, but I think that there's a priorityness to them. So I think the most fundamental is sentience. That gets you into the conversation. I think, as I mentioned before, an awareness of yourself through time and an ability to form even basic desires in regards to future events grounds your right to persist through time. I think that comes in a gradient, in the sense of the more desires you form and the more united you are with yourself, the more aware you are of yourself, the stronger the right is. Or in a sense, the more stuff has that, the more benefit has to be, the more the benefit that has to be produced to outweigh that right. And I think generally, all this stuff comes on a gradient. So if what you care about is intelligence, if what you care about is self-awareness, if what you care about is, self-awareness through time, this stuff comes on a gradient. And generally, the idea is that there's a basic moral right, and the more of this stuff you have, the greater the considerations needed to outweigh those rights. So I think there's other criteria than those. I personally think that there are certain cases, like, it's fascinating you mentioned the dolphin thing. I was just thinking about this myself. Between a choice of eating like beef or pork and eating dolphin meat, even if dolphin meat is tastier or more delicious, I would feel strange eating it because I know it comes from a intelligent being, a being in its cognitive capacity closer to me than the pig or the cow. And I can't explain why I have this um, desire not to eat the dolphin meat. I really do have this feeling of like, I shouldn't be doing that. I can't quite find a moral reason for it, because I guess I think about this in terms of general principles. I think moral facts are general facts or general properties that are then applied to particular cases. And I'm trying to think of what possible general fact or property could explain my reluctance to engage with dolphin meat that is already on the plate, alongside beef. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe that's just a derivation of, the more intelligent the being, the more right they have to life, and that intuition is kind of bleeding over into the emotional I'm overly focused on the already dead meat in front of me. But I may be being reductive about my intuitions. I may be discarding intuitions when in reality, they are worth keeping and worth incorporating into my. And this is where I want to make another methodological question. It is implausible to expect that every single one of your moral intuitions will neatly fall into a row. You will be able to call a name and put on a shelf. It is inevitable in applied ethics that you will have 50 intuitions, and a certain set of them will have to be abandoned for the others to be put in this coherent row. And a lot of the challenge of conversations like this is identifying which intuitions we are willing to discard and which intuitions we're willing to keep. And in this case, with the dolphin meat example, where you already have the dolphin meat in front of you with, cow meat and pig meat right next to it, I'm willing to say that that is just sentimentality. Once the meat is already there, it is what it is. But then you bring up human meat, which which makes things even more difficult because it's literally my species, and I don't. It's fascinating. I really think that there's some sort of dignity or like post death worth moral property that needs to be established that I'll have to think about. So I can't give a full answer to that now, but I think that there's something fascinating floating in the air here that is worth considering.
Yes, I agree. And for me, it's kind of unproblematic. Like the fact that cannibalism, for example, is like very close to a universal cultural taboo. Humans all around the world are repulsed by it and don't do it. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but that's true, right? In the same way that incest is another one, and murder. Those are considered the three sociologically universe mores or taboos: murder, incest, and cannibalism. And then you can. I think that things like that, like I don't think it's cognitively problematic to say that that is enough of a reason for us to maintain that taboo, and to say it is moral to observe those taboos and immoral to break them, right? Now I agree there's like certain times where the logic isn't really there. It doesn't check out why certain incest situations are unethical if, for example, there's no chance of children, or there's people were raised separately, and then, you know what I mean, like there's certain times the category collapses. But I don't think it's problematic to say that it is morally valid to preserve social traditions such as not doing blasphemy, obscenity, cannibalism, and so forth. Like it's like I think that serves a purpose in and of itself. That's like a second order moral function above and beyond any consent or harm questions as well.
Well, I'll say this, and this is absolutely fascinating methodology. The question is, how liberal should we be about where we just produce fundamental moral principles, right? Because as you're pointing out to me, and now that I'm thinking about it, it's making more and more sense. There's a whole sway of cases which the seeming moral impropriety of which is irreducible to other general principles we already accepted, like don't make things suffer and don't kill them if they want to keep on living. But they seem as wrong and even wronger than some of the stuff that is covered by our general principles. And here's a fascinating question. If I can't find some other general principle that is seemingly fundamental to ground these things in, should I just assign a fundamentality to them immediately? Should I just say, listen, cannibalism just is wrong. There is no further explanation. Should I say, listen, when you have the choice to eating meat or eating the flesh of more intelligent beings just as wrong? And I guess I am more hesitant to just assign this fundamental ontological status to stuff that is that complicated or that um, viewed with like concepts, because it's hard to see cannibalism as a moral property or dolphin meat or intelligent meat as a moral property. But if insofar as we're working with moral intuitions, if that's where they're leading us, and if these intuitions are really strong, which I see them as being, and they might just warrant us saying, just no cannibalism, and no, the whys end there, because the whys have to end somewhere, right? And maybe that's as good a place for them to end as any.
That's right. I mean, that's why I think these kind of rules are important. And I could articulate them more, right? In this case, the underlying principle isn't just, cannibalism is wrong just because it's wrong. It would be cannibalism is wrong because human beings are reservoirs or recipients of social and cultural value and meaning, and emotional value and psychological value and meaning. So somebody's body is them still, right? So if I die, I am Shogun's body. And therefore, in a sense, I represent everything, all the social reference points that was ever targeted around Shogun, right? That's why you go to the trouble of having this big funeral and you show pictures and the coffin's there and the body's there and everybody who knew the person comes, because that body still contains all that significance of that person's life, right? So if you then, now this is very long-winded right now, right? But if you then chop the foot off and start eating it, you take something that is therefore, for lack of a better word, sacred, right? That will hold the body of the dead sacred in many cases, literally sacred. My cat just did a backflip. So blasphemy, again, I think cannibalism is essentially blasphemy, right? As well as obscenity, right? Blasphemy, obscenity, because you're profaning the dead, right? So something that is very crude, right? You fry up a taco, you chow it down, you shit it out the other end, right? Well, if you do this to some person who is someone's dad or a general or a president or whatever, you're taking this elevated thing and reducing it to something base, literally into poo. So for that reason, we've never really done this, because it's, and it was in the past, it was done as like one of the greatest ways to like show dominance over your enemies, or to, terrify their families, or to disrespect them to the greatest possible extent, precisely because, right? So it's a long-winded reason. And then the bigger reason why we don't allow these tipping points to be passed is because there's, like you say, there's only so many socially agreed upon things that we are revolted by and that we universally agree not to do. And if we allow those things to be done, we're really risking moral anarchy, really, because once you transgress the sacred taboos, then society itself has no remaining, firm place to stand at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I'm in the business of accounting for moral intuitions with reasoning, and then there's some three king intuitions that I'm just saying, no to, but then there's all these lesser intuitions that I'm successfully putting into, systematic principles, then I've failed a project, because the very projects to take the stuff with the highest intuitive force respect the cost of stuff with the lowest intuitive force. If I reverse that process, I have when I've gone on to do moral philosophy in the wrong way. There's a certain principle which is rearing its head here, which I'm starting to like more and more, and I think it explains the intuition about the dolphin meat versus beef, the intuition about dead bodies and cannibalism, and these rituals of honoring the dead and honoring their physical presence, even though they're gone in a living sense, and also maybe even bestiality. Because there's something about bestiality, even though it's two live things, there's a sense in which the human body is being degraded during that act. And I almost want to say that we have an understanding of a dignity which our bodies carry with them that makes acts like bestiality and cannibalism and even the eating of the body when other options are available morally impermissible. And it's funny because earlier I mentioned that oaks, because of their complexity, might have moral value. Well, our bodies also are incredibly complex. So maybe this is a derivation of a principle that living, living or previously living, or I mean, dead bodies are in some way living still. Loosely living, complicated organisms have some persisting moral value. I think something along those lines would make sense of the oak, the dolphin, cannibalism, and maybe even bestiality. What are your thoughts on that? I'm being a bit creative here. I don't know. Blue Lulu, I see your mic is unmuted.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in the problem of survival, which I think morality takes a backseat in a lot of the times. Every time, I think, actually. And a lot of the problems you guys are posing kind of play into that. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most cases of cannibalism occur because the parties are trying to survive. Like it's less a question. The question of morality isn't as a priority when you're dying. This is especially the case with humans, I think. So where does survival, so in measuring morality, why measure it based off what we can perceive from an animal, meaning behaviors or whatever, or if we can measure it based off convenience? Because a lot of morality, I think, has a relationship with how convenient things are. Yeah, sorry.
Did you reiterate your question? Yeah, just no, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Can you say it again in a different way? I feel like I've slowed down a little bit. So much of my brain juice has been taken from me, during my
Oh,
thinking of Shogun's cases. Explain it to me like I'm a like younger person.
so a way of measuring morality that you guys are talking about is judging it based off animal intelligence or human intelligence, and what, how we can see, how we perceive certain behaviors and how we perceive certain meaning. And that's why you would maybe not eat a dolphin and would probably eat a cow, because we perceive them to be smarter. But wouldn't all that take a back seat if there was a dolphin in front of you and there was no cows? You'd probably, and you were starving, you'd probably kill and eat the dolphin. Yeah, so how much of all of this intuition, you guys are always was talking about moral intuition. Where does that really come from? Is it intrinsic, or does it really just is a bigger part in how we survive, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give my response, and then I think Shogun can give his about this. I'll say this. I think it's important to separate between the psychological and the emotional, and then the intuitive, or the intellectual. And intellectual is a weird word. It is true that if you put me in a place with dolphin meat and you starved me for long enough, I would eventually succumb to eating the dolphin meat. Is a reality. It is also very likely that there is certain emotive mechanisms within me that lead me to do things, or lead me to avoid doing things, because evolutionarily doing those things or not doing certain things was conducive to my survival. Okay, but I think that's one part of the puzzle. I view the stuff we're talking about, moral properties, in the same way I view mathematical properties, or logical properties, or epistemic properties. To give an example, if you and I are talking about basic arithmetic facts like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it equals it necessarily, it always has to equal 4. I don't think there's a sense in which I evolved to be able to add things and understand basic sums and have basic arithmetic beliefs. But there's also a sense in which I understand that this claim just could not fail to be true. It has a certain assent to truthhood, which is so powerful that upon merely understanding the concepts involved, I understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I think in the moral realm, there are certain propositions which enjoy the same status. I think if merely understanding the sentence, it is wrong to torture children for mere fun, it forces you to assent to its truthhood if you understand the concepts involved. I don't understand what it means to deny that. If somebody denies that, they don't understand morality. They're not engaging with a moral language. But what Shogun and I are talking about is the gray area. So if we're using the math analogy, Shogun and I are talking about some intricacy of set theory, or some very deep part of an axiomatic debate between two mathematicians. Does this axiom exist, or does it not exist? Is this axiom more fundamental? And so we're kind of in the gray area of morality. And I think we have established a certain methodology, which is to honor the stronger moral intuitions. So honor stuff like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and not honor kind of the weaker, more complicated beliefs like in trigonometry or in set theory, stuff that is a bit more stuff that we're a bit more unsure about. So I think what Shogun is claiming, and where I agree with him, is that there's stuff like cannibalism, and there's stuff like honoring of the dead and bestiality, which seem as obviously wrong as anything. It's difficult to understand that using some general principle. So it's like having some arithmetic belief, but not being able to systematize that arithmetic belief with your other arithmetic beliefs. So we're trying to address that issue. And the last thing I did was offer him kind of a general principle that unites these. And that's where we're at. I'm not sure if I answered your question. My answer basically is yes, there's the emotive, but there's also the intellectual. And goddamn, I'm trying to do the second really hard. And I may be failing. I don't know.
And I mean, I agree. Yeah. And I think you could articulate it as saying, or at least consider if this is true, right? That it is immoral to do that which shocks and appalls the moral sentiments of the majority of people, right? So is that a fair moral axiom, right? You know, if and like an action, if the action that you do evokes, you know, near universal moral revulsion, I would argue that then is in itself implicitly, automatically morally harmful to do, right? Because you're, in a sense, you're victimizing people to some degree by shocking their moral sentiments, right? That so like because that's not a morally neutral experience that people have, right? So if people hear that, you know, someone ate their grandmother's leg or something, and they're all disgusted and outraged, then you've kind of, to some extent, you've hurt them, right? You've impacted them. And there is cases like this, right? So there's a Japanese artist who, you know, had his penis and balls amputated at a live event, right? At a dinner party type thing. Everybody bought tickets and were sitting there in suits and ties and dresses, right? And then he cooked and served his penis to the people at the party, right? They had all paid for this to be able to do this, right? So, you know, you could say, okay, well, he consented, they all knew what they were doing, nobody was forced. But I would argue such a display as this, like, is implicitly harmful to the social fabric, right? It just, you know, they would call it art, right? But then I would say that is, and this is getting off into different moral questions, but I would say that's where we should have a limit on free speech. And, you know, things that are atrocities, obscenities, and blasphemies, including cannibalism, would be banned, and no further moral justification would be needed than this is how we remain the kind of society that we want to be, right? These traditional values define the parameters of what kind of society we want to be, and that is enough reason to say you can't transgress it, you know.
Yeah, so I think that there's a very technical difficulty here. There's two ways of putting what you said. One I agree with, the other I have trouble with. If what you were saying is that we should not allow certain acts because they dissolve the social structure, some sort of social contract that we've engaged in the name of morality, then I think it's a very reasonable claim. We shouldn't pass around a penis, whatever that case was. We shouldn't do morally abominable things or things which are offensive to the senses, so to speak, because they degrade the very structure we rely on for stability or for safety. That's a simple causal claim. Don't do stuff that produces danger or possibility of danger. At the beginning of that, though, you referred to a principle which was don't do those things which are offensive to your moral senses. And if that itself is the principle, then I have trouble, because that amounts to saying don't do all the stuff that you find morally counterintuitive. So it's basically saying you don't need to organize your moral intuitions and put them into these neat principles that you follow. If you just find something morally counterintuitive, if you find it morally abominable, without having to explain why it is morally abominable or what founds that property, you just know not to do that thing. And I think there's a danger there. The danger is that I personally don't think that specific. So the way I see moral properties is this, and you might disagree. There's a particular reason why your chair is red, or there's a particular reason why some entity exhibits some property. What grounds why some entity exhibits some property isn't that specific instance. There's some more general law. There's some more general pattern which grounds those aspects of our reality. So it's not that my chair just is red and that chair is red and that chair is red. There's a certain structure. There's a certain thing they all share that makes them all red. So I want to do the same thing with morality. I want to take all my moral intuitions, these specific instances, and unite them in coherent moral principles, because those are the things which I consider to be fundamental and um, verifiable and meaningful and reasonable. I am inclined to not rely so much on particular intuitions, because when I do so, and my view is also that moral intuitions are fallible. They're generally reliable, but they're fallible. So each given intuition has some a non ignorable probability of being wrong, but the whole system of moral intuitions, the whole system of moral data, will provide a coherent view of the moral reality if properly analyzed. So I view moral intuitions as individually fallible but systemically reliable. And so in my view, analyzing individual intuitions, saying whatever is offensive to our intuitions is immediately wrong, is not the way I want to engage morality. But there's people on the other side of the spectrum. There are people that disagree with me on this. I don't find their views very convincing. I don't know if that objection makes sense to you, Shogun. Maybe that's a little bit outside the scope of the conversation.
No, it does. And again, if anyone, it's an open mic now. If anyone wants to jump in and participate at any time, feel free. I guess I just want to respond to one thing you said, right? So, yeah, you said we wouldn't do anything that goes against our moral intuitions, and yeah, there's probably maybe times when you should do that. Although actually, I'm wondering about that. But it's not so much what I was saying as what I was saying is when the action that you do causes an intense moral revulsion by the majority of people and by a large number of people, then that is itself harmful, right? That is itself causing sort of an offense against people, right? So, for example, God forbid, if some, artist maybe said they were going to do a piece of art where they were going to have an abortion and then cook the fetus and eat it, in a video, because that was going to be their pro-life or, pro-abortion, pro-choice statement or some kind of artistic statement, right? That would outrage and revolt and disgust, right? Tons of people. I would hope almost everybody, right? And if that were carried out, in a sense, then that person would be hurting all the people who were horrified and disgusted by that. So what I'm trying to suggest is that it is therefore morally offensive to give massive moral offense, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's like, yeah. So it's not a neutral action to create moral outrage. It's actually the outrage exists precisely because some harm has been perceived by all the people who are even made aware of it,
Yeah. So that's what I took you to be saying in the former part. And so if I'm understanding you properly, say we do moral philosophy for centuries and we have thousands and thousands of intuitions and we have an ideal theory and it incorporates all of them other than one or two really intense intuitions or really intense moral feelings, however you want to define stuff that doesn't make it into the theory. And some artist comes out and does stuff that is immediately opposing to those intuitions. Now, most people in the commune in which we live in don't know about our theory. They just see this act and they say, my God, morality really has come to an end. So in a sense, the idea is the action does not have to have a determinate moral status for it to do moral damage, insofar as it can disguise as a moral action and cause a moral revolt. If that's what you mean, if what you mean is that certain action can produce this moral fragility or this moral decay, even if we don't understand why they have moral status, they might not even have a moral status. If that's the claim you're making, then I totally agree. Am I understanding you properly?
Yeah, I think so. Really, it was a tangent from the animal rights discussion, right? And for sure, I would say that the moral significance of really hurting and traumatizing living animals the way that we do with factory farming, including myself, just who eats steaks and chicken and whatever, is probably the most morally significant thing I do in my life, right? If I'm to be honest, like all the things I might think might make me a good person, like being honest or, being honorable or going to church or, whatever you say makes you good, probably it all pales in comparison to just the harm you cause to animals through eating meat, right? If you're objective about like suffering to conscious beings. But at the same time, I think that level of moral order is really significant. But then I just also think there's a second moral order to the things that you would say are without noticeable victims, because there's consenting adults, or because the person is dead and they consented to it, could still be on a second order harmful by causing some kind of moral decay, moral corruption, or moral outrage. And that's why, one order of morality is, benevolence versus malevolence, right? Doing good versus doing evil. Compassion,
fuck you.
sadism. But the second moral order would be honor, which is more your conduct and like uprightness. But what were you saying, NSA?
I don't know. I had so many things to say about everything about this. I'm sorry. I'm a little drunk.
No, it's fine.
If you can cognitively organize the sentence.
Well, so morality is this concept, like, so the religious right, as it were, it views morality as, I have morality because of God, because there is this invisible concept, the spiritual thing. But to the atheist, what does morality mean? And then we have guys like Albert Pike coming up and be like, well, no, we'll unleash the nihilists and the atheists because they don't understand what it is to believe in. So I get fucked up about it, man. Like, because it's, I don't know. How do I describe it? Morality is, there's subjective truth. There's subjective truth, objective truth. There's natural law. There's all the things that go into defining all the things that humanity creates as this concept of morals. And so, what are we to do? We're just thrown at this. We're just thrown at this abyss. Like, we're just like, hey, figure this out. We give you this concept. And there's so many people out there. There's 7 billion people on Earth, right? So like, there's 3.5 billion people that don't even have an internet, and running water. So these people, like, what is their morality like, and why should we, as I'm sitting here talking to you on $1,000 laptop through a $1 trillion internet, and they don't even know what that means. They have no concept of what that means. But they're still a human. They're still a human.
That's a lot of different things. Thank you. But
Sorry.
Reply.
No, I think I can muster a halfway coherent reply. What I want to say is the unfortunate state of things is such that a very small percentage of us have the time or the luxury to sit around and think about such things. Other beings just have to act upon their their more primal, unreflective instincts or intuitions, which isn't a bad thing. I think generally we have an understanding of what goodness is, even if we don't sit around and write it out and make sense of it with fancy words. I want to say that my own view, and we could do another podcast on this in the future. My own hope is to divorce morality from God or any sort of religion. I think moral facts have an ascent to the truth in the same way, as I mentioned before, uncontroversially mathematical, logical, epistemic, metaphysical facts do. I don't want to engage with God as a mediator between myself and this sort of basic intuitive knowledge. Shogun, what I want to say to you was that this first order, second order distinction, I probably understand and see indifferently, but one thing that I learned from this podcast and that I took away was even if we sit down and we establish certain fundamental principles, which unquestionably and uncontroversially apply to a wide range of cases, there are these pesky instances, these pesky rituals and these pesky social traditions, which have, as you've noticed, persisted consistently and powerfully for centuries. And some of our best theories don't explain our emotional and human engagement in such traditions. And I think there is some work to be done here to cover for those. I'll make an effort to read up about how to make sense of bestiality and cannibalism and quasi-religious practices, and I'll have to get back to you. I think that might be a interesting future podcast. So
I absolutely agree. That would be a great podcast in the future. I discuss the universal taboos or social taboos in general, things like that. But today we're talking about animal rights, and we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a really good discussion. But are there other aspects of that you want to get into in this episode?
There's one final thing I want to say, and if you want to have the audience ask more questions or do whatever you want afterwards, please feel free. I just want to say that in doing this, we encountered this methodological question: do we prioritize general principles, or do we prioritize specific intuitions or specific practices? I think there is an enormous debate to be had there, and I think the way we answer that technical question will probably determine how much of the rest of the debate goes. So I'm definitely going to go back to the drawing board and try to make sense of that too, because I have my views, but I haven't elaborated them and thought about them in a long time. I wrote a paper about this 3 years back or 2.5 years back, and I haven't really thought about that question since then. So I'm walking away from this podcast with the knowledge that there is a lot of work to do for me to make sense of this stuff better. And that's all I have to say.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's a good place to wrap it up. It's been a really good conversation. I think we can all agree we should all try our hardest to minimize the suffering and maximize the happiness of other beings. Mostly, maybe I can't assert that without defending all the ethics claims involved, but we're all in agreement on the basic principles of compassion and benevolence, and I think we can all agree that animals are deserving of that to whatever degree. But anyways, I shouldn't have tried to get a moral last word in there. But I did want to thank you, Jigmo, for your time. This is episode 4 of Philosophy with Jigmo. Please find the other 3 excellent episodes on YouTube and on BitChute. And of course, join the Roundtable Discord server where we record this podcast every day at 8 Central. Thanks, everybody. Let's all jump up to Roundtable 1 and we can keep chatting. And we'll close this recording here. Thank you.